The room they brought me to was not what I expected. I had expected a cell, cold floor, metal walls, the specific architecture of a place designed to reduce you to a number. Instead, it was a proper room with a table, and 2 chairs and something warm in a cup waiting on the table, which told me that whoever had arranged this meeting had done some research on human habits and had decided that warm cups were the right opening move. They were not wrong. My name is Sergeant Elena Voss, and I want to tell you how I came to be sitting across from General Kaelsorn of the Sorvian 7th Fleet in a room with a warm cup and an unanswered question hanging in the air between us. 14 hours before this meeting, I had been the last standing member of a 12-person reconnaissance unit in the outer Harith corridor. We had gone in to extract civilian data from a coalition outpost that the Sorvian advance had cut off, and we had gotten the data out, all of it, and then the corridor had closed behind us and the extraction window had disappeared, and we had spent 6 hours fighting a retreat through terrain that was not designed for retreating through. By the time we reached the fallback position, there was only me. I want to say that simply without drama, because that is how it happened, in the specific undramatic way that these things happen in actual conflict. One person at a time, each one a decision made in a moment that could not be revised. I ran out of ammunition at approximately 3 in the morning against a hillside that the Sorvian forces had surrounded completely. I sat with my back against the rock and the empty weapon in my hand and thought about options. The options were: continue fighting without ammunition, which was briefly possible and quickly fatal; attempt escape, which the surrounding forces made geometrically implausible; or wait and see what came next. I waited. What came next was a Sorvian officer with a translator unit and a formal request that I accompany him, phrased with a courtesy that surprised me enough that I stood up and went, which was how I came to be sitting across from General Kaelsorn. He was not what I expected either. I had expected the architecture of authority, the specific way that military commanders arrange themselves to communicate power. Kaelsorn sat across from me like a person at a table, present, attentive, looking at me with the focused curiosity of someone who had a genuine question and intended to ask it. He let me drink the warm cup before he asked anything. Then he said he had a question he had been wanting to ask a human soldier for a long time. He said his forces had engaged human military units on 6 separate occasions in the outer corridor conflict. He said in all 6 engagements, the human units had behaved in a way that was consistent across all encounters and inconsistent with every other species his forces had faced. They did not surrender. Not never. He was precise about this. He said human units surrendered when surrender was the outcome of a specific tactical calculation, when it preserved something that mattered more than the position being held. That kind of surrender he understood, that was rational. What he did not understand was the other kind. The kind I had been demonstrating on a hillside for 6 hours with 12 people against significantly larger forces. The kind that continued past the point where tactical calculation supported it. The kind that his analysts described as irrational, and that his officers described as something they did not have a word for. He asked what it was. I looked at him across the table for a moment. He had asked a real question, not a rhetorical one, not a tactical probe. A genuine inquiry from someone who had been watching something he did not understand and wanted to understand it. I owed him a real answer. I said there was a thing that humans understood about losing that most species did not. He waited. I said losing a position was not the same as losing. I said a position was a location, a moment, a specific configuration of resources and terrain that existed right now and would be different in an hour. Losing a position meant the position was gone. It did not mean anything else was gone. It did not mean anything else was gone, unless you decided it did. He said what was not gone. The people who came after, I said. The ones who would be in a different position in a different moment, who needed the time that holding this position bought them. And the thing that the position meant, the reason it was worth holding, which did not disappear when the position did. He said you were holding a position for people who were not there. I said we got the data out, I said. 12 hours before we were surrounded. A team on the other side of the corridor had that data and was moving with it. Every hour we held the hillside was an hour they had to move further. He was quiet. He said, you knew that? I said every one of us knew that, I said. That was why it was not irrational. The calculation was just longer than the immediate position. He said, how long? I said, as long as it needed to be, I said. He looked at me. He said, that is not a tactical answer. I said, no. I said, it is a human one. He sat back slightly and looked at me with those Sorvian eyes that were doing serious and careful work. He said, I have fought many species, he said. I have learned to predict most of them because most of them optimize for the same variables. Survival, resource preservation, Positional advantage. When those variables reach a certain balance, the behavior becomes predictable. He said human behavior does not become predictable. At that balance, I said, because those are not the only variables, I said. He said, what are the others? I thought about the hillside and the 6 hours and 11 people and a data package moving through the outer corridor. I said, meaning? I said simply. He looked at me. I said, humans fight for positions, and we fight for resources, and we fight for survival, exactly like everyone else. I said, and then there is a category underneath all of those that we also fight for, which is what the fighting means and who it is for, and whether it will matter when it is over. He said, and that category does not have a breaking point. I said, it has a different kind of breaking point. I said, it breaks when the meaning is gone, when what you are holding the position for no longer exists or no longer needs holding for. At that point, humans stop as cleanly as anyone. He said, but not before. I said, not before. He was quiet for a long time. Outside the room, the Sorvian vessel ran its operations, and somewhere in the outer corridor, a data team was moving with information that it cost 11 people in 6 hours, and an empty ammunition magazine and a seat at a table with a warm cup. He said, the data your unit extracted. I said, yes. He said it contained coalition outpost defensive configurations for the outer Harith corridor. I said I did not look at what was in it. I said, I was tasked with extracting it. I extracted it. He said, do you know what we would have done with that information if we had reached the outpost before your unit did? I said yes. He said, and you held a hillside for 6 hours to prevent that. I said 12 of us held it. I said, I was the last one still holding it. That is a different thing. He looked at me. He said, you are making a distinction between what you did and what your unit did. I said, they did more, I said. I just lasted longer. He was quiet again. Then he said something I had not expected from a Sorvian general, all in a room that could have been a cell. He said the data was not recovered by his forces. He said the data was not recovered by his forces. He said the coalition corridor positions in the outer Harith zone remained intact. He said this as a statement of fact without apparent regret, which surprised me. I said, why are you telling me that? He said, because you asked a question with 6 hours on a hillside, he said, and the answer deserved to be given directly. I looked at him. He said, you asked whether it would matter, he said. That was the question underneath the 6 hours. Whether the meaning would survive the position. He said it did. I sat with that for a moment. He said, you will be returned to coalition custody through formal prisoner exchange channels. He said, the process will take approximately 4 days. He said, the warm cup was a gesture of respect that his culture extended to opponents who had answered questions honestly. I said I understood. He said he had one final question. I said, go ahead. He said, if the situation had been reversed, he said, if the data had not gotten out, if the 6 hours had bought nothing, he said, would you have held the hillside anyway? I thought about it honestly, the way the question deserved. I said I would have held it as long as there was a reason. I said, if the reason had been gone, I would have stopped. He said, how do you know when the reason is gone? I said, you feel it. I said, not vaguely, specifically. There is a moment when the thing you are holding the position for is either safe or gone, and you know it the way you know when a wound is serious and when it is not. The body knows before the mind catches up. He said, you felt that on the hillside. I said, I felt the opposite, I said. I felt it still there, still moving, still needing time. He said, so you kept holding. I said, yes. He was quiet. He stood and I stood, and he looked at me, one last time across the table. He said, Sergeant Elena Voss. I said, yes. He said, I have been fighting wars for 23 years, he said. I have sat across from captured officers from 14 species. He said, none of them answered my questions the way you just did. I said, what did they answer? He said, most of them gave me tactical information or tactical silence. He said, you gave me something I did not have a category for before this conversation. I said, what category? He looked at me steadily. He said, the one where the position and the meaning are two separate things, and the meaning does not fall when the position does. He said, I will think about that for a long time. He left, and the officer came to take me to the holding area where I would wait for the 4 days of exchange processing, and I walked through the corridor of a Sorvian vessel, thinking about 11 people and a hillside and a data package and a general who had asked a real question and listened to the real answer. The exchange went through on day 4 as promised. The coalition debrief took 2 days, and the medical clearance took 3 more, and then I was back in the outer Harith corridor on a posting that was different from the one before and the same in all the ways that mattered. The data from the outpost had been used. The corridor positions had held. It had mattered. That was the answer to the question, underneath the 6 hours. It always mattered. That was why you held the position until you knew.